The automatic doors of Kroger's slid open with a familiar whoosh, and Pete Rose stepped into the fluorescent-lit sanctuary of mundane normalcy. At 78, his once powerful frame had softened around the edges, but his eyes still held that familiar spark of determination that had made him Charlie Hustle during his playing days. The Cincinnati air hung heavy with late summer humidity, and the air conditioning inside the store provided immediate relief from the oppressive August heat. Pete grabbed a shopping cart, its wheels squeaking in protest as he maneuvered toward the produce section. This had become his routine over the past few years. Thursday evenings at 6:30 p.m., when the store was relatively quiet and he could shop without drawing too much attention. Not that people didn't recognize him, they did. But most Cincinnatians had grown accustomed to seeing their fallen hero navigating the aisles like any other retiree, and they generally respected his privacy. The weight of his lifetime ban from baseball still pressed down on his shoulders like a lead blanket, even after all these years. 34 years since he'd been banished from the sport he loved more than life itself. 34 years of watching from the outside as new generations of players took the field, knowing he'd never be allowed back into the fraternity that had defined his existence. He picked up a bag of apples, examining each one with the same intensity he'd once reserved for reading pictures. The mundane task of grocery shopping had become a meditation of sorts, a way to quiet the constant noise in his head. The what-ifs, the regrets, the endless replaying of decisions that had cost him everything. Mr. Rose, is that really you? Pete looked up to see a middle-aged man in a Reds jersey approaching tentatively. The man's face was lit up with the kind of reverence usually reserved for religious figures. "Depends who's asking," Pete replied with a wry smile, though his voice carried the wariness of someone who'd been burned by public attention before. "I'm sorry to bother you, sir. I'm Dave Patterson. I was at Riverfront Stadium on September 11th, 1985, when you broke Ty Cobb's record. Changed my life, watching you get that 4,192nd hit. I named my son after you." Pete's expression softened. This was the part of his legacy that remained untarnished, the memories of pure baseball before everything got complicated. That was some night, wasn't it? I can still feel the crowd shaking the stadium. Yes, sir, that crowd was electric. 47 minutes of standing ovation. I get goosebumps just thinking about it. Dave shifted nervously. "I know you probably hear this all the time, but you should be in the Hall of Fame. What happened afterward?" "Well, that's between you and baseball. But what you did on the field, nobody can take that away." Pete nodded, appreciating the sentiment even as it reopened old wounds. "I appreciate that, Dave. I really do. Give my regards to your boy." As Dave walked away, Pete continued through the produce section, his mind wandering back to that magical night at Riverfront Stadium. The crack of the bat, the ball falling into left field, the eruption of 60,000 voices celebrating not just a record, but the culmination of a career built on pure hustle and determination. For those 47 minutes, he had been untouchable, beloved, the undisputed hit king, but that was a lifetime ago. Pete made his way through the store methodically, bread from aisle 7, milk from the dairy section, his usual box of Cheerios. He'd learned to live a quiet life, punctuated by card show appearances and the occasional interview where reporters still asked the same questions about gambling and redemption. He'd made peace with most of it, or at least that's what he told himself. The cereal aisle was nearly empty, except for a young woman crouched down near the bottom shelf, frantically searching through boxes of kids' cereals. Her movements were agitated, desperate, and Pete could hear her muttering under her breath. Come on, where is it?" As he got closer, Pete noticed a small boy, maybe 6 or 7 years old, standing nearby. The child was crying, not the dramatic wailing of a tantrum, but the quiet, heartbroken sobs of someone trying to be brave. His face was red and tear-streaked, and he kept wiping his nose on the sleeve of his oversized Reds t-shirt. "Mommy, it's okay," the boy said, his voice trembling. "I don't need the cereal. We can get something else." The woman, his mother presumably, looked up from her search with eyes that were also wet with tears. She was young, maybe late 20s, with dark circles under her eyes that spoke of too many sleepless nights and too much worry. Her clothes were clean but worn, and Pete recognized something in her posture that he'd seen in his own mother during the lean years of his childhood. The weight of trying to hold everything together when everything was falling apart. "No, baby," she whispered, her voice cracking. "You've been so good, and I promised you Lucky Charms if you helped Mommy with all the errands today. I'm going to find them." She went back to searching, pulling out box after box, but Pete could see what she couldn't or wouldn't admit. The Lucky Charms were there, right at eye level, but they were priced at $4.99. The boxes she was examining were all store brand, priced at $2.99 or less. Her hands shook slightly as she reached for a generic equivalent. "Look, sweetie," she said, forcing brightness into her voice. "Here are some marshmallow cereals. They're just like Lucky Charms, okay?" The boy looked at the box and nodded, but his lower lip quivered. "Okay, Mommy. Thank you." Pete felt something twist in his chest. He'd grown up in a small house on the west side of Cincinnati, the son of a bank cashier who worked multiple jobs to keep food on the table. He remembered the careful mathematics of poverty, the way his mother would count and recount the money in her purse at the grocery store, the way she'd put things back when the total got too high, the way she'd smile and tell him they didn't really need whatever it was he'd asked for. But he also remembered the rare occasions when strangers had shown unexpected kindness. The neighbor who'd invited him for dinner when his parents were working late. The coach who'd bought him his first real baseball glove. The teacher who'd slipped him lunch money when she thought no one was looking. Those moments of grace had shaped him as much as his natural talent. Without thinking, Pete reached for a box of Lucky Charms and walked over to where the mother and son stood. "Excuse me," he said gently. "I couldn't help but overhear. Is this what you're looking for?" The woman looked up, startled, and Pete saw recognition flicker across her features. Her cheeks flushed red with embarrassment. Oh my God, you're..." She swallowed hard. "I'm sorry, we weren't making too much noise, were we? I was just..." "You weren't making any noise at all," Pete assured her. "I just thought maybe I could help." "What's your name, buddy?" he asked, crouching down to the boy's eye level. The child wiped his nose again and looked up at this stranger with cautious hope. Tommy Reeves." "Well, Tommy Reeves, I happen to have an extra box of Lucky Charms here that I don't really need. You think you could help me out by taking it off my hands?" Tommy's eyes widened, and he looked up at his mother uncertainly. "Mommy?" The woman, Pete could see now that she was probably younger than he'd initially thought, maybe mid-20s, shook her head quickly. "That's very kind, but we can't accept charity. Thank you, but we're fine." There was pride in her voice, the kind of fierce independence that Pete recognized from his own upbringing, but there was also something else. Fear, maybe, or shame. He could see her struggling with the kindness being offered, wanting to accept it for her son, but unable to swallow her pride. "It's not charity," Pete said carefully. "It's just one person helping another. Besides, Tommy here looks like he might be a baseball fan." He nodded toward the boy's Reds t-shirt. "That's a good team to root for." Tommy's eyes lit up for the first time since Pete had been watching. "I love the Reds. My daddy took me to a game before he..." The boy's voice trailed off, and he looked down at his shoes. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken pain. Pete felt that familiar ache in his chest, the same feeling he got whenever he thought about all the games he'd missed, all the moments that had slipped away because of his mistakes. "Before he what, buddy?" Pete asked gently. "Before he had to go to heaven," Tommy whispered. Pete looked up at the boy's mother, and now he understood the exhaustion in her eyes, the careful way she counted every dollar, the weight she carried. She was doing this alone. "I'm sorry for your loss," Pete said, and he meant it. "I bet your daddy was really proud of you." Tommy nodded, fresh tears starting to flow. "He said I was his MVP." Pete felt something break open inside his chest. Without hesitation, he placed the box of Lucky Charms in Tommy's hands. "You know what, Tommy? I think your daddy was right. MVPs deserve Lucky Charms." The boy clutched the box to his chest like it was made of gold, and his mother covered her mouth with her hand, tears flowing freely now. "Thank you," she whispered. "You have no idea what this means." But Pete did know. He remembered being 7 years old and wanting something so simple, so small, that most people wouldn't think twice about it. He remembered the weight of disappointment and the way his mother's forced smile made everything worse because he knew she was hurting too. "What's your name?" Pete asked the woman. "Sarah," she said, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "Sarah Reeves. Well, Sarah, it was nice to meet you both. Tommy, you take care of your mom, okay?" "I will," Tommy said solemnly. Then, looking up at Pete with those innocent eyes, he asked, "Are you somebody famous? You look familiar." Pete chuckled. "I used to play baseball, a long time ago." "Were you good?" "I tried my best," Pete said. "That's all anyone can do, right?" As he walked away, Pete heard Tommy ask his mother if they could watch baseball together sometime, and Sarah's soft, "Of course, baby," followed him down the aisle. Pete finished his shopping in a daze, his mind replaying the encounter. At the checkout, he found himself adding a $20 gift card to his purchase. He couldn't explain why, but something told him he might need it. The parking lot was nearly empty as Pete loaded his groceries into his car, the evening air thick with the promise of rain. He sat in the driver's seat for a moment, not starting the engine, just thinking about Tommy's face when he'd clutched that box of cereal, about Sarah's proud refusal of help even when she clearly needed it. He thought about his own father, who died when Pete was just starting his professional career, never getting to see him break records or become a household name. He thought about all the kids who'd looked up to him over the years and how he'd let them down with his choices. But tonight, for just a few minutes, he'd been able to be the person he'd always wanted to be. Not the hit king, not the gambler, not the band player, just someone who could help a little boy get his Lucky Charms. As he started the car and pulled out of the parking lot, Pete Rose made a decision that would change everything. The next Thursday couldn't come fast enough for Pete. All week, he'd found himself thinking about Tommy and Sarah, wondering how they were doing, hoping things were getting easier for them. It was a strange feeling. He'd spent so many years focused on his own problems, his own exile from baseball, that he'd forgotten what it felt like to genuinely worry about someone else's well-being. He arrived at Kroger's a little earlier than usual, 6:15 p.m. instead of his customary 6:30. The parking lot was busier than he expected, filled with families grabbing dinner ingredients after work and school activities. Pete found himself scanning the crowd, looking for a familiar red-headed woman and a small boy in a Reds t-shirt. Inside, he grabbed his usual cart and made his way through the store, but his heart wasn't in the routine shopping. He kept glancing around corners, hoping to catch sight of them. By the time he'd made it through produce, dairy, and half the grocery aisles, he was beginning to think they weren't coming. Maybe Sarah shopped somewhere else. Maybe Thursday had just been a coincidence. Maybe he'd built this up in his mind more than he should have. Then he heard it, that same quiet crying from the week before. Pete abandoned his cart and followed the sound to the pharmacy section at the back of the store. Sarah was standing in front of the prescription counter, Tommy beside her, both of them looking defeated. The pharmacist, a stern-looking woman in her 50s, was shaking her head apologetically. I'm sorry, but without insurance, it's going to be $127 for the full prescription. We do have a generic version for $89, but you'd need to check with your doctor first. Sarah's face went pale. Can I call him? My doctor? Of course, but his office is closed now. You'd have to wait until tomorrow. Pete watched as Sarah knelt down to Tommy's level. The boy was holding his stomach, his face flushed with fever. "What's wrong, buddy?" she whispered, stroking his forehead. "My tummy hurts really bad, Mommy, and I feel hot." "I know, baby. Mommy's going to figure this out, okay?" Sarah stood back up and addressed the pharmacist. "Is there anything else? Anything over the counter that might help until tomorrow?" The pharmacist's expression softened slightly. "For what he has, the ear infection and fever, you really need the antibiotic. The over-the-counter stuff will help with the pain and fever, but it won't clear up the infection." Pete could see Sarah doing calculations in her head, the same kind his mother used to do. He watched her open her purse and count the bills inside, watched her shoulders sag when she realized she was short. "Okay," Sarah said finally. I'll come back tomorrow. Thank you." She took Tommy's hand and started to walk away, but the boy stumbled slightly, clearly unwell. That's when Pete stepped forward. "Excuse me," he said to the pharmacist. "I'd like to pay for the boy's prescription." Sarah spun around, her eyes wide with recognition and embarrassment. No, you can't. We're fine, really." "Sarah, right?" Pete said gently. "And Tommy? From last week?" Tommy's feverish eyes focused on Pete with effort. "The Lucky Charms, man," he said weakly. Pete's heart broke a little. "That's right, buddy. How are you feeling?" "Not good," Tommy admitted. Pete turned to the pharmacist. "I'll take care of the prescription, the full one, not the generic." "Sir, that's very generous, but you don't understand," Sarah said, her voice tight with emotion. "I can't keep accepting help from strangers. I have to figure this out on my own." "Why?" Pete asked simply. The question seemed to catch Sarah off guard. Because that's what responsible adults do. They take care of their families without relying on handouts. Pete nodded thoughtfully. "Can I tell you something? When I was about Tommy's age, I got really sick, pneumonia. My dad was working 2 jobs, and my mom was trying to make ends meet, but the medicine I needed was expensive. A neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, I'll never forget her name, she paid for it." He paused, looking down at Tommy, who was listening intently despite his fever. "My mom was just like you. Proud, independent, didn't want charity. But Mrs. Henderson told her something I never forgot. She said, 'This isn't charity, this is community. Someday when you're in a position to help someone else, you'll do the same thing. That's how it works.'" Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "But I don't know when I'll ever be in a position to help anyone else. I can barely keep our heads above water as it is." "You will be," Pete said with quiet confidence. "I can tell. You're raising a good kid, you're working hard, you're doing everything right. Things are just tough right now. But they won't always be." Tommy tugged on his mother's sleeve. "Mommy, I really don't feel good." Sarah looked down at her son, then back at Pete. The internal struggle was clear on her face, her pride warring with her child's needs. If I let you do this," she said slowly, "how do I pay you back?" "You don't," Pete said. "You pass it forward when you can. That's all." The pharmacist had been watching this exchange with growing interest. Now she leaned forward slightly. "Are you Pete Rose?" she asked quietly. Pete nodded, and Sarah's eyes widened further. "Oh my God," Sarah breathed. "The Hit King. I should have recognized you right away. My husband was a huge fan. He always said you were the greatest player who ever lived." "Your husband had good taste," Pete said with a small smile. "What was his name?" David Reeves. He died in a car accident 8 months ago." The words came out in a rush, as if she'd been holding them back for too long. "He was a mechanic, had his own shop. We weren't rich, but we were doing okay. Then he died, and I found out he'd been putting all the business profits back into the shop, thinking it would be worth more later. There was barely any life insurance, and I had to sell the shop to pay for the funeral and the debts. Pete listened, understanding now why Sarah was so fiercely independent. She'd lost everything and was trying to rebuild from nothing. "I'm working 2 jobs now," she continued, "waitressing during the day and cleaning offices at night. Tommy stays with Mrs. Rodriguez next door when I'm working nights, but I hate having to impose on her. I keep thinking David would be disappointed in me for not being able to handle this better." "Sarah," Pete said firmly, "your husband would be proud of you. Look at what you're doing. You're working 2 jobs, taking care of your son, keeping your family together. That takes incredible strength." Tommy had been listening to this conversation with the solemnity of a child who'd been forced to grow up too fast. Now he looked up at Pete with curious eyes. "Mr. Rose, are you famous because you were really good at baseball?" "I was pretty good at it, yes," Pete said, crouching down to Tommy's level. "But you know what made me good?" Tommy shook his head. "I never gave up. No matter how hard things got, no matter how many times I struck out or made mistakes, I kept trying, just like your mom is doing now." "Mommy's the best," Tommy said loyally. "I can see that," Pete agreed. "She's fighting really hard for you, isn't she?" Tommy nodded, then winced as another wave of pain hit him. Pete stood up and addressed the pharmacist. "Let's get this prescription filled. And do you have any children's Tylenol back there? Something for the fever?" As the pharmacist bustled around gathering the medications, Pete pulled out his wallet. Inside, along with the cash for the prescription, was the gift card he'd bought the week before. On impulse, he handed it to Sarah. "This is for groceries," he said. "Before you say no, think about it as an investment in Tommy's future. A kid can't learn and grow if he's hungry." Sarah stared at the gift card, tears streaming down her face now. "I don't understand why you're being so kind to us. You don't even know us." Pete was quiet for a moment, thinking about how to answer that. The truth was complicated. It had to do with redemption and second chances, with trying to balance the scales of his own life with the simple human need to do something good after so many years of regret. But Tommy was listening, and Sarah was struggling, and complex explanations weren't what they needed right now. "When I was playing baseball," Pete said finally, "I always believed that every at-bat was a chance to do something good. Every time I stepped up to the plate, I could help my team, make the fans happy, show people what was possible if you just never gave up." He paused, watching as the pharmacist counted out Tommy's pills. "I haven't had many chances like that lately. But today I can help a little boy feel better and make sure he has what he needs. That seems like a pretty good at-bat to me." The pharmacist handed over a white paper bag with Tommy's antibiotics and fever reducer. "Give him one of these twice a day with food," she explained to Sarah. "The Tylenol can be given every 4 hours as needed for fever or pain. He should start feeling better within 24 to 48 hours. Sarah took the bag with shaking hands. "Thank you," she whispered to Pete. "Both of you. I don't know what to say." "Don't say anything," Pete replied. "Just take care of Tommy and yourself. And Sarah?" She looked up at him. "Your husband was right about one thing. You are the best. Tommy's lucky to have you." As they prepared to leave, Tommy suddenly tugged on Pete's jacket. "Mr. Rose, will you be here next week?" Pete looked down at the boy's hopeful face, then at Sarah's embarrassed expression. "Would you like me to be?" he asked. Tommy nodded eagerly. "Maybe you could tell me more about baseball." Pete glanced at Sarah, who gave him a small, grateful smile. "I think I can do that," Pete said. "Same time next week?" "We'll be here," Sarah said softly. As Pete watched them walk toward the exit, Tommy already looking a little brighter, knowing help was on the way, Sarah holding her son's hand and the precious bag of medicine, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Purpose. For 34 years, he'd been defined by his mistakes, by what he'd lost, by doors that had been closed to him. But maybe there were other doors, other ways to make a difference, other at-bats that mattered. Maybe it wasn't too late to be the person he'd always wanted to be. The following week, Pete arrived at Kroger's with more than just his shopping list. Tucked under his arm was a worn baseball glove, his old practice mitt from his coaching days, and in his cart, alongside the usual groceries, was a package of baseball cards he'd picked up at a sporting goods store. He found Sarah and Tommy in the produce section, and he was relieved to see that Tommy looked much better. The boy's color had returned, and he was helping his mother pick out apples with the focused determination of someone taking their job seriously. "Hey there," Pete called out as he approached. "How's my favorite MVP feeling?" Tommy's face lit up. "Mr. Rose, I'm all better. The medicine worked really good." "Really well," Sarah corrected gently, but she was smiling. She looked better too, less exhausted, more hopeful. "And what do you say to Mr. Rose?" "Thank you for helping me feel better," Tommy said solemnly. "You're very welcome, buddy. I brought something for you." Pete held out the package of baseball cards. "These are from this season. Maybe we can look at them together." Tommy's eyes went wide. "Really? For me to keep?" "Absolutely. But first, we should probably get our shopping done, right? Your mum's got a list to follow." As they moved through the store together, and Pete was surprised by how natural it felt, this routine of shared grocery shopping, Tommy chatted about everything he'd learned about baseball from watching games on their small apartment TV. "Mommy got the cable working again," he explained, "and we watched the Reds play the Cardinals. Joey Votto hit a home run. Do you know Joey Votto?" Pete chuckled. "I've met him a few times. Good player, real professional." "Are you friends with all the baseball players?" Tommy asked. The question was innocent, but it hit Pete in an unexpected way. The truth was, he didn't have many friends in baseball anymore. His ban had created a wall between him and the sport he'd devoted his life to. Most current players knew his statistics, but not him personally. He existed in a strange limbo, famous but isolated, respected but banned. "Not all of them," Pete said carefully. "I haven't been around the game as much lately." Sarah, who had been quietly listening to this exchange, caught something in Pete's tone. "Tommy, why don't you go grab a loaf of bread from aisle 7, the one with the blue wrapper that we usually get?" Tommy scampered off, and Sarah fell into step beside Pete. "I looked you up," she said quietly. "After last week, I wanted to understand who had been so kind to us." Pete felt his stomach tighten. Here it comes, he thought. The judgment, the questions about gambling, the inevitable disappointment when she realizes what kind of person she's been accepting help from. "I'm sure you found plenty to read," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "I did," Sarah admitted, "and I want you to know, it doesn't change anything. What happened between you and baseball, that's between you and baseball. What I saw was a man who helped a sick child and asked for nothing in return. That's the person I know." Pete stopped walking and looked at her directly. "You might be the first person in 34 years to say something like that to me." "Then you've been talking to the wrong people," Sarah said firmly. "Look, I don't know much about sports or gambling or whatever happened back then, but I know about making mistakes. I know about trying to do better, and I know kindness when I see it." Tommy came jogging back with the bread, slightly out of breath but proud of his successful mission. "Got it," he announced. "And I saw cookies, but I didn't ask for any because Mommy says we have to stick to the list." "Good job, buddy," Pete said, ruffling Tommy's hair. "You know what? I think sticking to the list deserves a reward. What do you think, Sarah?" Sarah looked at the budget she'd written on the back of an envelope, then at her son's hopeful face. "I think one package of cookies won't hurt the budget." As Tommy raced off to get the cookies, Sarah turned back to Pete. "Can I ask you something?" "Shoot." "Why us? I mean, I'm grateful, don't get me wrong. But you could help anyone. Why did you choose to help Tommy and me?" Pete was quiet for a moment, pushing the cart slowly down the aisle while he thought about how to answer. "You know, I've spent most of my adult life being watched," he said finally. "Reporters, fans, critics, commissioners, everyone always watching, always judging, always keeping score. And for a long time I thought that was normal. I thought that was just how life worked." He paused as Tommy came running back with a package of Oreos. "But watching you two last week, seeing how much you love each other, how hard you're working just to take care of your family, it reminded me of something I'd forgotten. Most of life isn't about grand gestures or being famous. It's about small moments, quiet kindness, doing the right thing when no one's keeping score." Sarah smiled softly. David used to say something like that. He'd say, "The measure of a man isn't what he does when everyone's watching. It's what he does when no one will ever know." Your husband sounds like he was a wise man. "He was," Sarah agreed. "I think he would have liked you." They finished shopping together, and as they headed toward the checkout, Pete made a decision. "Sarah, can I ask you something now?" "Of course." "How would you and Tommy feel about getting out of this grocery store once in a while? Maybe catching a Reds game sometime?" Sarah's eyes widened. "Oh, Pete, that's incredibly generous, but tickets to a major league game—" "I still have connections," Pete said with a grin. "Perks of being a former player, even a controversial one." Tommy, who had been opening his new pack of baseball cards, looked up sharply. "We could go to a real baseball game at the stadium, if your mum says it's okay." Tommy looked at Sarah with the most hopeful expression she'd seen since before his father died. "Mommy, please?" Sarah looked from her son to Pete, clearly torn between pride and the desire to give Tommy this experience. "I don't know," she said slowly. "It feels like too much." "It's not about the money," Pete said quietly. "It's about sharing something I love with people I've come to care about. Baseball was my life for so long, and I haven't been able to share that joy with anyone for years. You'd actually be doing me a favor." "Can I think about it?" Sarah asked. "Of course." "No pressure." As they approached the checkout lanes, Tommy tugged on Pete's sleeve. "Mr. Rose, I found your card." He held up a baseball card, not from the current season, but an older one featuring a much younger Pete Rose in his Reds uniform, mid-swing, his face set with familiar determination. "That's from 1975, Pete said, taking the card to examine it. "I was 34 that year." "Same age as you are now, Sarah." "You look so serious," Tommy observed. "I was concentrating." "That's what you have to do if you want to be good at something. Concentrate, practice, never give up. Like how Mommy concentrates when she's working." Pete looked at Sarah, who blushed slightly. "Exactly like that. Your mom is working really hard to take care of you, and that takes the same kind of focus and determination that baseball does." At the checkout, Pete insisted on paying for Sarah's groceries again, overruling her protests with gentle stubbornness. As they loaded their bags, he pulled out a piece of paper and handed it to Sarah. "What's this?" she asked. "My phone number, in case Tommy has any questions about baseball, or if you ever need anything at all." Sarah stared at the paper. "You're giving us your personal phone number?" "Why not? We're friends now, aren't we?" That evening, Pete sat in his modest house in Cincinnati, looking through photo albums he hadn't opened in years. Pictures from his playing days, from championship celebrations, from record-breaking moments. But none of them brought him the same satisfaction he'd felt today. Watching Tommy's face light up over a pack of baseball cards, or seeing Sarah smile without the weight of worry for just a few minutes. His phone rang around 8 p.m. The caller ID showed an unfamiliar number. "Hello? Mr. Rose, it's Sarah. I hope it's not too late to call." "Not at all. Is everything okay?" "Everything's fine. I just wanted to tell you, Tommy hasn't stopped talking about the baseball cards. He's got them spread out on his bed, trying to memorize all the statistics on the back. And he keeps asking questions I can't answer about RBIs and ERA and things like that." Pete chuckled. "Sounds like he's got the bug." The baseball bug, I mean. I think he does. And Pete? About the game. If the offer is still open, we'd love to go. Tommy would never forgive me if I said no to that. Pete felt a warmth spread through his chest. The offer is definitely still open. How does Sunday afternoon sound? The Reds are playing the Pirates. That sounds perfect. After they hung up, Pete sat back in his chair and smiled. For the first time in decades, he was looking forward to a baseball game, not as a former player trying to recapture past glory, but as someone excited to share the joy of the sport with new friends. Maybe this was what redemption actually looked like. Not a grand gesture or an official pardon, but quiet moments of connection, small acts of kindness, the simple pleasure of helping a little boy fall in love with baseball. Tomorrow, he'd start planning their trip to Great American Ballpark. He wanted to make sure it was perfect. Sunday afternoon arrived, with the kind of perfect baseball weather that made Cincinnati summers magical. Clear skies, temperature in the low 80s, just enough breeze to keep things comfortable. Pete had arranged to pick up Sarah and Tommy at their apartment, and as he pulled up to the modest complex on the west side of the city, he felt a familiar flutter of excitement in his stomach. It had been years since he'd attended a Reds game as anything other than a reluctant spectator watching from the stands like any other fan. Today felt different. Today, he was bringing Tommy to his first major league game. Tommy was waiting by the curb, practically bouncing with excitement, wearing his cleanest Reds t-shirt and a brand new cap that Pete had dropped off earlier in the week. Sarah looked nervous but happy, dressed in jeans and a simple blouse, her purse clutched tightly, as if she couldn't quite believe this was really happening. "Ready for some baseball?" Pete called out as they approached the car. "I've been ready since Thursday," Tommy exclaimed, climbing into the back seat. "I studied all my baseball cards, and I know that the Reds are in second place in the National League Central, and Joey Votto has a batting average of .301, and the starting pitcher today is Luis Castillo." Pete grinned at Sarah as she buckled her seatbelt. "Sounds like someone's been doing his homework." "He's been obsessed," Sarah said, but her voice was full of affection. "I had to make him put the cards away at dinner last night so we could eat." As they drove toward downtown Cincinnati, Pete pointed out landmarks along the way: the neighborhood where he'd grown up, the high school where he'd first started to attract attention from college scouts, the bridge over the Ohio River that connected Cincinnati to Kentucky. "That's where I used to run in the off-season," he told Tommy, pointing to the riverfront. "Every morning, 5 miles along the river, rain or shine." "Even when it was cold?" Tommy asked. "Especially when it was cold. That's when you find out what you're really made of." Sarah watched this exchange with quiet amazement. A week ago, her biggest concern had been whether they could afford Tommy's medicine. Now here they were, getting a personal tour of Cincinnati from one of the most famous players in baseball history, on their way to a major league game. "Pete," she said quietly, "I still can't believe you're doing this for us." "Believe it," Pete replied. "Besides, I'm probably more excited than you are. It's been a long time since I've gotten to see a game through fresh eyes." Great American Ballpark rose up before them, like a cathedral of red brick and steel, the afternoon sun glinting off the windows and the giant baseball bat sculptures flanking the main entrance. Tommy pressed his face against the car window, trying to take it all in. "It's so big," he breathed. "Wait until you see the inside," Pete said, pulling into a parking space that he'd arranged through his contacts with the team. "That's where the magic really happens." As they walked toward the stadium, Pete was surprised by how many people recognized him. Unlike at the grocery store, where people generally left him alone, the baseball setting seemed to invite more attention. Fans called out greetings, asked for autographs, wanted to shake his hand. "Mr. Rose, still the hit king." "Pete, thanks for all the memories." "Charlie Hustle, legend." Pete signed a few autographs and posed for pictures, but he kept the interactions brief, mindful of Sarah and Tommy beside him. He noticed how Tommy watched everything with wide eyes, beginning to understand that the man who had been buying him cereal and medicine was someone truly special in the world of baseball. "Are you famous like movie stars are famous?" Tommy asked as they approached the entrance. Pete considered this. "Different kind of famous, buddy. Movie stars are famous for pretending to be other people. I'm famous for being really good at a game I loved. And for being banned from baseball," Sarah added quietly, then immediately looked embarrassed. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to—" "No, you're right," Pete said. "That's part of it too. Sometimes being famous means people remember your mistakes as much as your achievements." They passed through security and into the concourse, where the sounds and smells of baseball hit them immediately. The crack of bats during batting practice echoing from the field, the aroma of hot dogs and popcorn, the excited chatter of families and friends gathering for an afternoon of America's pastime. Pete had arranged for seats along the first baseline, close enough to see the players' faces, but not so close that they'd be bothered by foul balls. As they settled into their seats, Tommy couldn't stop staring at the field. "It's so green," he said wonderingly, "and so big." 325 feet down the right field line, Pete said automatically. 328 down the left field line. Center field is 404 feet from home plate. "How do you remember all those numbers?" Tommy asked. "When you play the game long enough, the dimensions become part of you. You know exactly how much room you have to work with, where you need to hit the ball to get it out of the park, which angles will give you the best chance for a base hit." Sarah was watching the field with a different kind of appreciation. "David always said he wanted to bring Tommy to a game," she said softly. "He kept saying, 'next season,' or 'when things slow down at the shop.' He never got the chance." Pete looked at her carefully. What would David think about Tommy being here today? Sarah was quiet for a moment, and Pete worried he'd overstepped. Then she smiled. He'd be jealous as hell that Tommy got to meet Pete Rose and he didn't. David always said you were the toughest player he'd ever seen. He used to tell stories about watching you dive headfirst into bases, the way you'd run out every ground ball like it might be the most important play of the game. "Your husband understood the game," Pete said. "A lot of people think baseball is just about talent, but it's really about effort, about giving everything you have, every single time." The Reds took the field for the top of the first inning, and Tommy stood up with the rest of the crowd, cheering wildly, even though nothing had happened yet. Pete felt a familiar thrill watching the boys' excitement, remembering his own first trip to Crosley Field as a child, the way the game had seemed like the most magical thing in the world. "Okay, Tommy," Pete said as the Pirates' leadoff hitter stepped into the batter's box. "Let me teach you how to really watch a baseball game." For the next 2 hours, Pete provided a running commentary that was part instruction, part storytelling, and part pure love of the game. He explained the strategy behind every pitch selection, the positioning of the fielders, the way base runners read the pitcher's moves. He told stories about his own playing days, about teammates and opponents, about the pressure of big moments and the joy of clutch hits. Tommy absorbed every word like a sponge. When the Reds turned a double play in the third inning, he cheered and then immediately turned to Pete to ask how the second baseman knew exactly where to throw the ball. When Joey Votto worked a full count walk in the fifth, Pete explained the chess match between hitter and pitcher, the way elite players could recognize pitches in fractions of seconds. "Baseball looks simple," Pete said as they watched Votto take his lead off first base, hit the ball, run to first base, try to score runs. But really, it's the most complicated, simple game ever invented. Every pitch has a purpose, every swing has consequences, every decision matters. In the seventh inning, something special happened. The Reds' shortstop, a young player named Martinez, fouled a ball back into the stands, and it bounced off the protective netting right toward their section. The ball ricocheted off a few hands and rolled to a stop right at Tommy's feet. Tommy looked down at the ball, then up at Pete with an expression of pure wonder. "Is this really happening?" he whispered. "Pick it up, buddy," Pete said, grinning. "That's yours." Tommy carefully lifted the baseball as if it were made of precious metal. The leather was scuffed from big league use, and you could see the official MLB stamp and the worn seams. It was a real game ball, touched by real major league players, carrying with it all the magic and history of the sport. "This is the best day of my whole life," Tommy announced, clutching the ball to his chest. Sarah wiped away a tear, overwhelmed by her son's joy and by the kindness of the man who had made this possible. She looked at Pete, who was watching Tommy with an expression she'd seen before. It was the same look he'd had in the grocery store when he'd given Tommy the Lucky Charms, the look of someone who had found something he'd been missing for a long time. The Reds won 7-4, with Votto driving in the go-ahead runs with a clutch two-out double in the 8th inning. As they filed out of the stadium with the happy crowd, Tommy chattered non-stop about everything he'd seen, everything he'd learned, everything he wanted to know more about. "Can we come back again sometime?" he asked as they walked toward the parking lot. "I want to see Luis Castillo pitch again, and I want to learn more about stealing bases, and maybe I could get another ball." "We'll see," Sarah said, but she was smiling. Pete stopped walking and turned to face them both. "Actually, I have an idea. Tommy, how would you like to learn how to play baseball? Real baseball, not just watching it." Tommy's eyes went wide. "You mean like Little League?" "Something like that," Pete said. "There's a youth league that practices at the park near your apartment. I know the coach. If you're interested, and if your mum says it's okay, I could talk to him about getting you signed up." "Could you really do that?" Tommy asked, his voice hushed with awe. Pete looked at Sarah, waiting for her approval. She hesitated, and he could see the familiar struggle, wanting to give Tommy everything but worrying about the costs, the logistics, the complications of single parenthood. "Sarah," Pete said gently, "let me take care of the equipment and the fees. Please, Tommy's got something special. I can see it in the way he watches the game, the questions he asks. He understands baseball in his heart, not just his head. That's rare." "I don't know what to say," Sarah whispered. "Say yes," Tommy pleaded. "Please, Mommy." Sarah looked from her son's hopeful face to Pete's earnest expression, and suddenly she understood something that had been nagging at her for weeks. This wasn't really about charity or pity or even kindness, though it was all of those things. This was about connection, about family, about finding purpose in unexpected places. Pete Rose, the hit king, the band player, the controversial figure, had found something in her and Tommy that he'd been searching for without even knowing it. And they had found something in him too. Not a famous baseball player, but a lonely man who had love to give and wisdom to share. "Okay," she said finally. "Yes, Tommy can play baseball." Tommy let out a whoop of joy that echoed across the parking lot, and Pete felt something settle in his chest that he hadn't felt in 34 years. For the first time since his ban from baseball, Pete Rose was back in the game that mattered most, the game of making a difference in someone else's life. 6 months later, the spring air in Cincinnati carried the promise of a new baseball season and the fresh hope that came with it. Pete Rose stood along the chain-link fence of the youth baseball diamond at Fernbank Park, watching 9-year-old Tommy Reeves step into the batter's box for what could be the most important at-bat of his young life. It was the championship game of the Intermediate League, and Tommy's team, the Cardinals, coached by Pete's old friend Mike Hutchinson, was trailing 4-3 in the bottom of the 6th and final inning. There were 2 outs, bases loaded, and Tommy was their last hope. Sarah stood beside Pete, her hands gripped tightly on the fence, her knuckles white with tension. Over the past 6 months, she'd become a fixture at these games, cheering louder than anyone, learning the intricacies of the sport alongside her son. She'd also become something Pete hadn't expected, a close friend, someone he could talk to about things that had nothing to do with baseball or his past mistakes. "He's nervous," Sarah whispered, watching Tommy adjust his helmet and take practice swings. "Good," Pete said quietly. "Nerves mean it matters to him. The key is learning how to use those nerves instead of letting them use you." Tommy stepped out of the box and looked toward the fence where Pete and Sarah were standing. Pete caught his eye and tapped his heart twice, then pointed at Tommy, their signal that meant, "Trust yourself, you've got this." Tommy nodded, stepped back into the box and settled into his stance. Pete had worked with him for hours on that stance, teaching him the same fundamentals that had carried Pete through 24 major league seasons. Keep your eye on the ball, stay balanced, be ready for anything. The pitcher, a kid who looked like he could already throw 70 miles per hour, wound up and delivered a fastball right down the middle. Tommy's swing was smooth and confident, and the crack of the bat told everyone in the park that he'd made solid contact. The ball sailed over the left fielder's head, bouncing off the fence as Tommy rounded first base. The runners ahead of him scored easily, and by the time the left fielder retrieved the ball, Tommy was sliding safely into third base with a game-winning triple. The Cardinals' dugout erupted, parents cheered from the stands, and Tommy's teammates mobbed him as he stood on third base with the biggest smile Pete had ever seen. "That's my boy!" Sarah shouted, tears streaming down her face. "That's my boy!" Pete felt his own eyes getting misty as he watched Tommy celebrate with his teammates. It wasn't just the clutch hit that moved him, though that was impressive enough. It was seeing the confidence in Tommy's posture, the way he'd handled the pressure, the pure joy on his face as he realized what he'd accomplished. Over the past 6 months, Pete had watched Tommy transform from a sad, grieving child into a happy, confident young athlete. But the transformation hadn't been one way. Tommy and Sarah had changed Pete just as much, giving him something he'd thought he'd lost forever. A reason to wake up excited about each new day. After the team celebration died down and the trophies were distributed, the three of them walked slowly toward the parking lot. Tommy was carrying his championship trophy and chattering about the game, replaying every pitch and every play with the detailed analysis of a future sportscaster. "Did you see how I waited on that curveball in the 4th inning?" Tommy was saying. "Just like you taught me, Pete. I didn't swing at the first pitch because I knew he wanted me to chase a bad ball." "You showed real discipline up there," Pete agreed. "That's not easy to do when the game's on the line." "Coach Hutchinson said I'm ready for the next level up," Tommy continued. "He said maybe I could even make the All-Star team next year if I keep working hard." Sarah listened to this conversation with a mixture of pride and amazement. 6 months ago, she'd been a single mother struggling to keep her family afloat, worried about every dollar, every decision, every uncertain tomorrow. Now, watching her son's confidence bloom and seeing the genuine friendship that had developed between Tommy and Pete, she felt like the luckiest person in the world. "Pete," she said as they reached their cars, "I want you to know how grateful I am. Not just for today, not just for baseball, but for everything. You saved us in so many ways." Pete shook his head. "Sarah, you've got it backward. You and Tommy saved me. 6 months ago, I was just an old ball player living in the past, feeling sorry for himself. Now I feel like I've got a purpose again." "You were always more than just a ball player," Sarah said firmly. "You were always the person who helped that scared mother in the grocery store. You just forgot for a while." Tommy, who had been listening to this exchange with the seriousness of someone older than his years, stepped forward and hugged Pete tightly. "I love you, Pete," he said simply. "Thank you for teaching me baseball. Thank you for being my friend." Pete felt his composure crack completely. He hugged Tommy back, this brave little boy who had somehow managed to fill a hole in his heart that he'd thought would stay empty forever. "I love you too, buddy. Both of you." As they prepared to leave, Sarah pulled out her phone. "I have something to show you," she said to Pete. "I've been saving it for the right moment." She scrolled through her photos and handed him the phone. On the screen was a newspaper clipping from that morning's Cincinnati Enquirer, The headline read, "Local youth coach makes all the difference." And below it was a photo of Pete working with Tommy and several other kids at practice. The article talked about Pete's volunteer work with the Fernbank Park Youth League, his mentorship of at-risk kids, and his quiet contributions to the community over the past 6 months. It mentioned his controversial past, but focused on his present. The man who showed up early to every practice, who bought equipment for kids who couldn't afford it, who taught them not just baseball skills, but life lessons about perseverance and character. "The reporter called me," Sarah explained. "She wanted to know about the man behind the headlines. I told her about the Pete Rose I know, not the gambling controversy, not the band player, but the person who saw a little boy crying in a grocery store and decided to help." Pete stared at the article, hardly believing what he was reading. For decades, newspaper stories about him had focused on his mistakes, his ban from baseball, his failures. This was the first time in recent memory that a story had been written about Pete Rose the person, not Pete Rose the cautionary tale. "There's more," Sarah said, taking the phone back and scrolling to another article. This one was from ESPN's website. Pete Rose finding redemption through youth baseball. The story detailed Pete's work with local kids, including interviews with parents and coaches who praised his dedication and positive influence. It talked about how he'd used his own money to fund equipment and league fees for families who couldn't afford them, how he'd become a mentor and father figure to children who needed guidance. Most importantly, it quoted Major League Baseball Commissioner Rob Manfred, who had been asked about Pete's community work during a press conference. While Mr. Rose's status regarding reinstatement remains unchanged, Manfred had said, "I want to acknowledge the positive impact he's having in his community, working with young people, teaching them the game and important life lessons. That's what baseball is really about." Pete looked up from the phone, stunned. "Did he really say that?" "He did," Sarah confirmed. "And there's been talk, just talk, but still, about MLB reconsidering some aspects of your ban. Apparently your work with kids has gotten their attention." Pete felt a flutter of something he'd thought was dead forever. Hope. Not hope for reinstatement necessarily, but hope that maybe his story wasn't over, that maybe there were still chapters to be written that weren't defined by his past mistakes. "Whether baseball ever accepts me back or not," Pete said slowly, "this feels like home. You, Tommy, these kids, this community. This is where I belong." Tommy tugged on Pete's sleeve. "Are you going to keep coaching us even if you get famous again?" Pete laughed and ruffled Tommy's hair. "Buddy, I'm going to keep coaching you until you're too good for me to teach you anything else, and maybe even after that." "Promise?" Tommy asked. "Promise." As they drove home that evening, the three of them in Pete's car because Sarah's had broken down the week before and Pete had insisted they ride together, Tommy fell asleep in the back seat, his championship trophy clutched in his arms and his baseball glove still on his hand. Sarah looked back at her sleeping son, then at Pete. "You know what the best part of all this is?" "What's that?" "David would have loved you. He would have loved seeing Tommy play baseball, and he would have loved knowing that someone like you was looking out for us." Pete was quiet for a moment, thinking about David Reeves, the mechanic he'd never met, who had loved his family so deeply that his influence was still shaping their lives. "I think about him sometimes," Pete admitted. "About what he'd think of me being around you and Tommy. I hope he'd approve." "He would," Sarah said with absolute certainty. "He always said that the best people are the ones who keep trying to be better, even after they've made mistakes. That's you, Pete. That's exactly who you are." As they pulled into the parking lot of Sarah's apartment complex, Pete realized that this was what redemption actually looked like. Not a grand gesture or an official pardon, not a speech from a commissioner or a plaque in Cooperstown, but this. A little boy sleeping peacefully in the back seat, dreaming about baseball. A mother who no longer worried about providing for her son. A community of kids who had learned that trying your hardest was more important than winning. Pete Rose had spent 34 years defined by what he'd lost: his eligibility for the Hall of Fame, his connection to organized baseball, his reputation. But sitting in that parking lot, listening to Tommy's gentle snoring and Sarah's contented silence, he realized that he'd found something even more valuable: a family, a purpose, and the knowledge that it's never too late to become the person you were always meant to be. The grocery store where it had all started was just a few blocks away, its neon sign visible in the distance. Tomorrow, Pete would probably go back there for his weekly shopping, just like he had for years. But now, he wouldn't be shopping alone. Tommy would want to come along to help pick out breakfast cereals and ask questions about baseball. Sarah would make a list and worry about the budget, but not with the desperation she'd once felt. And if they happened to see another struggling family, another crying child, another moment where a small act of kindness could make all the difference, well, Pete Rose knew exactly what he would do. After all, he'd learned from the best teacher of all, a 7-year-old boy who had shown him that sometimes the most important victories happen not on baseball diamonds, but in grocery store aisles, one box of Lucky Charms at a time. The Hit King had found his way home.